Why was everyone laughing except her? The humid air of the naval amphibious base gym pressed against every breath, thick with sweat, rubber, and quiet tension. On the worn blue mats, a circle of young sailors stood watching. They laughed nervously at something they didn't really find funny. Their eyes darted between the man packing before them and the woman standing still in the middle. Lieutenant Davis, all angles and arrogance. His uniform looked too clean, too crisp for the heat. The kind of man who thought sharp creases were a substitute for respect. And then there was Petty Officer Morgan, quiet still, her uniform faded by sun and salt but immaculate. No patches of ego, no wasted motion, just silence. He called her sweetheart. It hit the air like oil on water spreading fast, suffocating the room. Look, sweetheart, I don't care what the new diversity quotas say. This is my mat, and on my mat you're a liability until you prove otherwise. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some smiled to fit in, others looked down, but none of them spoke. Morgan didn't either. She stood with the kind of posture that came from years of discipline, relaxed but balanced, her center of gravity perfectly set. The Fleet Master Chief, watching quietly from the doorway, saw it immediately. He knew what that kind of stillness meant. It wasn't fear, it was control. Her gray eyes scanned Davis, not meeting but reading him, measuring the angle of his stance, the tension in his neck, the small shifts in his breathing. It was predatory calm, the kind that doesn't announce danger, it embodies it. But Davis saw none of it. To him, she was just another box checked, another experiment in equality. He thought the world owed him authority. He didn't realize respect has to be earned, or that the quiet ones are usually the ones you should never provoke. He turned to the group, hands clasped behind his back like a stage performer. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "The battlefield is no place for hesitation. It's where hesitation gets you killed. When your weapon jams, when the enemy is on top of you, what saves you is muscle, aggression, dominance." He gestured toward Morgan, and some of us just don't have that. The laughter came again, weak, uncertain. It wasn't humor, it was obedience, the kind that grows in places where rank replaces respect. Morgan said nothing. Her heartbeat didn't even rise. She'd been insulted by men with more power, and she'd survived far worse than words. Davis smiled wider, feeding on the attention. "Let's demonstrate." Petty Officer stepped forward. She was already standing there, unmoved. He grabbed her wrist too tight. It wasn't instruction, it was dominance disguised as training. His fingers dug in, his arm tensing with a petty kind of cruelty. "This," he said, "is what happens when a smaller opponent gets caught. No strength, no leverage, just physics." Morgan didn't resist. Not yet. Her body was a quiet map of muscle memory, waiting, analyzing, predicting. He twisted her arm upward, forcing her to bend slightly. "You see, this is what we call control. When you've got them like this, they're done." He looked to the others for validation. He wanted them to see her struggle, but she didn't. Her eyes never changed, calm, focused, measuring angles, calculating. Her silence infuriated him. It was supposed to be humiliation, not indifference. "So," he continued, voice rising, "the defender in this case has one chance won. She needs explosive power, perfect timing, and aggression. But let's be honest, some people just don't have that." He looked straight into her face when he said, "some people." That's when the air changed. The crowd didn't notice, but the Master Chief did. Morgan's breathing had slowed, her jaw relaxed, shoulders loosened. She wasn't tensing for a fight, she was preparing for a solution. Davis leaned closer, his breath hot with ego. "You'll never generate the force to move someone my size. It's physics," he said again, proud of the word he barely understood. He shoved her slightly. She didn't move. He frowned. "Let's try something more realistic," he said. "The attacker's striking now." His hand came up slowly, telegraphed a pantomime of violence. He swung toward her face, stopping inches away. You see, she should protect her head, but... He did it again, closer, harder. She moved barely an inch, a whisper of motion, graceful, exact. And that quiet defiance broke something in him. You're not taking this seriously, he snapped. Out there are no pulled punches. Out there's only this. The slap came fast, sharp, echoing across the gym. A crack like a gunshot. The room froze. Every breath in the building vanished. The young sailors stared in disbelief. This wasn't training anymore. It was an assault. Everyone knew it. And yet no one moved. Her head turned slightly with the impact. Then she looked back at him. No rage, no pain, just silence. And that was when he realized, too late, that silence wasn't surrender. She moved. No hesitation, no wasted motion. His wrist, the one gripping her, folded the wrong way. A precise rotation. A sound like knuckles cracking. He didn't even understand what had happened before she stepped in. Her hand struck his neck, not a fist, but open fingers, sharp and deliberate. The brachial plexus. A nerve command that shut his arm down completely. It went limp at his side, useless. His face twisted in confusion. He hadn't even hit the ground yet. She stepped into him, her hips low, her body turning like water finding its path. He was lifted, redirected, folded, and placed on his back, not thrown, not slammed. Controlled, engineered. She knelt with one knee pinning his arm, her forearm resting across his windpipe. 2 seconds, that's all it took. No shouting, no anger. Just control. The sailors stood frozen, eyes wide. Hands still half raised in the air as if unsure what reality they were in. The man who had lectured about dominance was now starring up, breath shallow, face pale, completely powerless beneath someone half his size. And she hadn't even broken a sweat. From the doorway, the fleet master chief stepped forward. His boots echoed like a gavel in the silence. Every sailor straightened instinctively. He didn't yell, didn't rush. His voice was low, the kind of tone that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. "Petty officer," he said evenly, "on your feet." She released Davis, moving back with fluid precision. He gasped, rubbing his throat, trying to find words, excuses, authority, but all of it had fled him. "Not one word, Lieutenant," the Master Chief said without raising his voice. The silence deepened. You could hear the air conditioning hum. The chief looked at the red mark on Morgan's jaw, then at Davis's trembling hands, then at the circle of sailors who had just watched everything they thought they knew about power disintegrate. He turned to the young aide beside him. "Pull her record," he said quietly. "Full file, Tier 1 clearance." The aide hesitated. Tier 1 meant classified, restricted to the highest echelons of the military, but he obeyed. The tablet beeped softly. The chief read. His face didn't change for a long time, then it did slightly. Respect. Real, unguarded respect. He looked up, eyes sharp as a knife's edge. "For those of you who have forgotten what this uniform stands for," he said, his voice calm but cutting, "let me remind you of the first rule, respect." He glanced at Davis, and the second, never assume. He lifted the tablet. "You, Lieutenant, assumed wrong." He took a step closer. The room felt colder. "You assumed because Petty Officer Morgan is a woman, she's weak. Because she's quiet, she's timid. Because her rank is lower, she'd tolerate your ego." He paused, then turned to the sailors. "You were looking at Specialist Morgan, first class." A ripple went through the room. Specialist, not petty officer. Different classification, special warfare. He read further. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. A collective breath sucked in. DEVGRU, SEAL Team 6. He kept reading. Combat deployments 7, theaters classified, qualifications, CQC instructor, master breacher, Tier 1 operator. He lowered the tablet. And then, in a motion that would be told for years after, the Fleet Master Chief, a man who had seen 3 decades of war, snapped to attention and saluted. "Specialist Morgan," he said, voice steady. "My apologies for the conduct of my officer. Thank you for your demonstration." The room held its breath. Hierarchy had just bent. A Master Chief saluting a specialist. Every sailor there understood, even if they couldn't explain it, they were in the presence of something real. Not rank, not bravado. Competence. And somewhere in that heavy silence, a truth took root, the kind that stays in the bones of a place long after the people are gone. Because sometimes strength doesn't need to shout. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. How long does silence last after the truth hits? At Coronado, it lasted for days. The humid training hall still smelled the same: rubber mats, disinfectant, sweat. But something in the air had changed. The laughter that once filled the gym was gone. The echo of that slap, that blur of motion, still haunted the place. And in its place, whispers began to spread. They started small, like ripples in still water. A recruit mentioned it in the chow line. Another repeated it in the barracks. By the next morning, everyone had heard. The lieutenant struck her, the quiet one, the one who didn't even flinch. But what followed, that part was what no one could agree on. Some said she dislocated his shoulder in one move. Others swore she knocked him out cold. A few even whispered that she'd snapped his wrist clean, that medics had to carry him out. The truth, though quieter, was far more unsettling. She hadn't needed to hurt him to destroy him. She'd shown control so absolute that it left him shattered. Petty officer, no, Specialist Morgan had become something else entirely. She moved through the base like a ghost now. People stepped aside when she walked past. They didn't even realize they were doing it. Conversations fell silent when she entered a room. Even the instructors, the ones who'd once corrected her form, questioned her endurance, now stood a little straighter when she was near. But Morgan noticed, and she hated it. She joined the teams to do her job, not to become a myth. She wasn't built for attention, she was built for silence. For the kind of work no one talked about, the kind that left no headlines or medals, only scars and shadows. She could still feel the lieutenant strike sometimes, not the pain but the sound of it. That sharp echo, that instant when the air went heavy and every eye turned to her. Not out of pity, not even out of shock. Out of expectation. Everyone had wanted to know, what would she do? And she'd shown them. She hadn't meant to. It wasn't ego. It was muscle memory, the body remembering what the soul had already accepted long ago. When a line is crossed, you move. But now, she couldn't walk the base without feeling the weight of that moment. One afternoon, she stood outside the same gym. The mat had been scrubbed, but she could still see the faint scuff where his head had hit. Someone had drawn a small black star in marker on the spot. She didn't know who. She didn't want to. The door creaked open behind her. Fleet Master Chief Thorne stepped out. He carried no clipboard, no rank-stripped authority, just the quiet dignity of someone who'd seen too many wars and lost too many good people. "Specialist," he said softly. She turned, her salute crisp, precise. "At ease," he murmured. They stood in silence for a while. The wind carried the smell of the ocean, salt and diesel from the harbor. "I read your file," he said finally. "Didn't know they still made them like you." "I didn't know they still read them," she replied. It wasn't meant to be defiant. It was just true. He smiled faintly, one of those smiles that never reached the eyes but meant something anyway. "That day, what happened out there, it's changed this place. You know that, right?" She said nothing. "They're calling it the Davis mark," he added. "That spot on the mat, the star." "I didn't do it to make a point," she said. "I know." He looked at her jaw, the faint bruise still visible. "But sometimes the world learns its lessons the hard way." He paused, voice lowering. You didn't break him, you just showed everyone who he already was. That hit her harder than any strike could, because deep down she understood. She hadn't wanted to humiliate him only to stop him, but the truth of what she'd done had rippled far beyond that mat. Thorne looked out at the ocean. You know what the hardest part of command is, Morgan, watching people confuse loudness for leadership. He sighed. You reminded them what real strength looks like. Doesn't mean they'll thank you for it. I don't want thanks, she said quietly. I know you don't. He turned to her then, his voice rough with something like pride. That's why you're dangerous, not because you can break a man in 2 seconds, but because you don't need to. She didn't respond. She didn't need to, he understood. Later that evening, the base was quiet. The sun dipped low over the Pacific, turning the water to molten gold. Morgan sat alone on a bench near the docks, her gear bag beside her, boots unlaced. She was off duty, but she didn't know how to stop being ready. A pair of young sailors passed by. They slowed when they saw her, then nodded respectfully, saying nothing. When they were gone, she closed her eyes. The ocean murmured softly against the pylons. She thought about her last deployment, a place she couldn't name, faces she couldn't forget. She remembered the sand, the gunfire, the waiting, the way silence always came before the radio crackled back to life. She remembered the last order she'd given, one that had saved lives but cost others. That was the thing no one understood about quiet professionals. The silence wasn't peace. It was the weight of everything they carried and never spoke of. Her fingers brushed her jaw, the same one Davis had struck. It no longer hurt, but it stayed with her as a reminder. Not of him, of her own restraint. In another life, another mission, she might have reacted faster, harder. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was a lesson, one that every set of eyes in that gym needed to see. The difference between dominance and control. Control wins every time. When the Master Chief had saluted her, she'd felt nothing triumphant, only the heavy stillness of understanding that she would now forever represent something she hadn't asked for, a symbol. And symbols never get to rest. A seagull's cry broke the moment. She opened her eyes, breathing in slow, steady rhythm. Then she stood, laced her boots, and walked back toward the barracks. That night she slept lightly, the kind of half-sleep soldiers live in, ready to move at a breath's notice. The next morning, as dawn painted the base in orange light, she was already in the gym, alone. No audience this time, just the echo of her own breathing and the rhythmic sound of fists hitting the pad. Thud, thud, thud. Each strike was clean, precise, no anger, no wasted energy. The repetition wasn't for strength, it was for silence, for peace. She wasn't training to fight. She was training to remember who she was. The door opened behind her. Someone stepped in hesitant. A young sailor, barely out of his teens. He cleared his throat. Specialist Morgan. She stopped mid-motion, wiped her brow and turned. I was there that day, he said quickly, nervous. In the gym. She didn't speak, only waited. I just wanted to say, he swallowed hard. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. Morgan studied him. His uniform still crisp, his boots too new, his eyes too wide. She'd seen 1,000 like him, brave, eager, still untouched by the weight of consequence. It was a technique, she said simply. Ma'am. The moves, she clarified. Leverage and timing, nothing more. He blinked, but the way you... Assumptions, she interrupted gently. That's where people get hurt. The lieutenant assumed, don't make the same mistake. The sailor nodded, embarrassed. Yes, ma'am. She looked at him a long moment. The training works, trust it. Don't idolize the person. Understand the principle. And with that, she turned back to her drills. The young sailor stood there for a moment longer, unsure whether he'd just been corrected or taught something deeper. Then he left, quietly closing the door behind him. Inside, the rhythm resumed. Thud, Thud, thud. Outside, the rumor kept growing. But the story wasn't just about a takedown anymore. It had become something else, a legend with a heartbeat. A reminder that arrogance can fall faster than gravity, and respect can be earned in a single, silent act. Somewhere in the command office, Lieutenant Davis packed his things. He'd been reassigned, a quiet exile dressed up as promotion. No one asked where he was going, no one cared. The halls seemed lighter without his voice in them. But Morgan didn't celebrate, she didn't even mention it. For her, the story was already over. Or at least she thought it was. Because in the weeks that followed, something unexpected began to happen. Training routines changed. Instructors started emphasizing leverage over brute strength, control over chaos. And every time a recruit hesitated, an instructor would point to the blue mat and say, "Remember the Morgan counter." It became doctrine, an unwritten rule, a new kind of respect encoded in muscle memory. She hadn't meant to teach them anything, but sometimes the lesson chooses you. And in her quiet heart she understood, legacies don't start with speeches. They start with silence and what you choose to do inside it. How long does it take for a story to become legend? Sometimes only a single heartbeat. At Coronado, the heartbeat was that moment on the blue mat, the slap, the silence, the blur of motion that followed, the sound of arrogance collapsing under the quiet weight of competence. Days turned into weeks. The base kept moving, training cycles, drills, inspections, but something in its rhythm had shifted. You could feel it in the way recruits looked at each other. Instructors spoke softer now, with more measure. Even the air felt cleaner. The story of Specialist Morgan had traveled faster than any official report ever could. It moved through the barracks like an invisible current, carried by whispers, passed through shared glances and hushed voices at night. Everyone knew the story, but no one could quite agree on the details. Some said she broke the lieutenant's arm. Others swore she'd flipped him so hard the mat cracked. A few insisted she'd been recruited by some secret task force right after. But every version, no matter how embellished, always carried one truth. She never raised her voice. Not once. The myth didn't grow because of what she did. It grew because of what she didn't do. No celebration, no anger, no victory pose, just stillness. That kind of power unsettles people, because it forces them to see what real control looks like, the kind that doesn't need noise. The sailors began to change. Where once there had been rivalry and ego, there was quiet respect. Where once size and rank defined authority, now competence did. And right in the middle of it all, the mark on the mat, the tiny black star someone had drawn, became sacred. Every new class of recruits was brought to that spot on their first day. The instructors would gather them in a circle, the smell of rubber heavy in the air, the ocean breeze slipping through the open doors. They would tell the story. A grizzled chief, his voice rough with age and wisdom, would point to the faded mark and say, "This is the Davis mark. This is where arrogance died." The recruits would stand silent, not sure whether to be inspired or afraid. And the chief would continue. "It's named after a man who forgot what respect means, and a woman who reminded him without saying a word." They would hang on every syllable, because they knew someday they'd be tested too, and maybe they'd remember that silence could be sharper than any weapon. Morgan never attended these introductions. She didn't have to. She was busy doing what she always did, showing up early, working alone, keeping her edges sharp. She'd become the embodiment of quiet professionalism, the standard everyone measured themselves against, even if she hated being noticed. But Thorne noticed. He'd see her sometimes at dawn, jogging along the seawall, the horizon still pink. Her movements were efficient, economical, no wasted effort. Every stride was measured, every breath deliberate. He'd watch from a distance and think, This is what we're supposed to look like. She didn't know it, but she'd done more for the command's culture than a dozen policy memos ever could. One morning, Thorne found her again, this time in the armory. She was disassembling a sidearm with clinical precision, her fingers moving like they were tracing an old memory. "Still here?" he asked softly. "Still working, Master Chief," she replied without looking up. He leaned against the doorframe. "You know, most people would have transferred out by now, after all the attention." "I'm not most people." He smiled faintly. "No, you're not." He stepped closer. "They're teaching your counter now, officially." She froze mid-motion, the slide halfway out of her hand. "My what?" "The move," he said. "The takedown. They've added it to the combatives curriculum. Module 7 Bravo. They call it the Morgan counter." Her brow tightened. "That's ridiculous." "Maybe, but it's effective. And it's changing how they think. That's something." She set the weapon down gently. "I didn't do it for that." "I know." His tone softened. "But that's the thing about actions like yours, they outgrow your intention." She looked down at her hands, steady, unshaking, calloused from years of repetition. "I just reacted." He nodded slowly. "Exactly. You didn't act out of pride, you acted out of principle. That's why it matters." There was a pause, long, quiet, comfortable. The kind shared between people who understood the same language of silence. Finally she asked, "What happened to him?" "Davis." He sighed. "Gone, reassigned, Pentagon desk. They're calling it a promotion." She gave a small, humorless smile. "Paper punishment." "Exactly. He'll never set foot on a mat again." Morgan turned back to the gun, snapping the slide into place. The metal clicked sharply, echoing in the small room. "Sometimes exile is mercy," she murmured. Thorne tilted his head. "And sometimes it's justice." Neither spoke for a long time. When he finally left, she remained there, staring at her reflection in the gunmetal, the faint scar above her brow, the shadows under her eyes. The face that looked back wasn't the legend they whispered about. It was just hers. That night she wrote a letter, not to anyone in particular, just to herself. She did it sometimes after operations to clear her head. "They think strength is about force," she wrote. "It's not. It's about discipline, about knowing when not to strike, about holding your ground when everything inside you wants to react. That's the part they'll never understand from a story." She folded the letter neatly and tucked it into the inside pocket of her duffel bag. Then she went asleep. The next day, orders came down. Temporary transfer, classified location. She didn't ask where. She didn't need to. She'd been waiting for this kind of silence again, the kind that only comes before a new mission. By dawn she was gone. No farewell, no ceremony. Just an empty bunk, a folded uniform, and a reputation that had already outgrown her presence. Weeks later the story reached Washington, then Virginia Beach, then beyond. Everywhere sailors trained, they told it, a cautionary tale wrapped in respect. And slowly, something began to shift across the wider fleet. Young officers learned to listen before speaking. Instructors stopped using humiliation as a tool. Women in the ranks found that doors once closed now opened just a little easier. The difference wasn't policy, it was memory. The memory of a quiet woman who didn't need to prove herself until someone forced her to. On the anniversary of that day, 1 year after the incident, the gym was filled again. New recruits, new energy, same blue mats. The mark was still there, faded but visible. Chiefs told the story once more. The younger sailors leaned in, wide-eyed, hanging on every word. And as they listened, one question began to grow in their minds, the same question that haunted the first crowd that had watched it unfold. How could someone so calm be that dangerous? The answer hung in the air, unspoken, because that was the lesson. The calm ones always are. After the session, when the recruits dispersed, one young woman lingered near the mat. She knelt down and traced the faint outline of the star with her fingertip. Her instructor noticed. "You'll make your own mark one day," he said quietly. She looked up. "Do you think she's still out there?" The chief smiled. "Oh, she's out there. People like her don't disappear. They just move where the noise can't follow." And he was right. Somewhere across the world, in a desert compound, or a rain-soaked jungle, or a steel ship cutting through black water, Specialist Morgan was moving again, doing what she was trained to do, doing it with the same silence that had once filled a gym in California. She didn't know that her name was still whispered, that her story had become doctrine. And if she had known, she wouldn't have cared. Because the quiet professional doesn't seek legend. They just leave it behind. How do you carry a legend you never wanted? You don't. You carry your pack, you carry your weapon, you carry the mission. The rest, the whispers, the myth, the mark on the mat, those things carry you. For Specialist Morgan, deployment was supposed to be an escape from all of it. A return to the only world that made sense, the one where purpose was clear, orders were simple, and silence wasn't awkward, it was survival. But even in the field, the ghosts of Coronado followed her. It had been months since she'd left the base under quiet orders. The destination was classified, a place without coordinates, where the sun rose over dust and tension, and every radio transmission carried a heartbeat behind it. The unit was small, Tier 1, the kind that didn't exist on paper. They called themselves Echo. 4 operators, all ghosts in their own right, the kind of people who didn't salute, didn't talk much, and didn't need to. Morgan fit right in, or so she tried to believe. Their mission: extract a high-value informant from a collapsing city, 1 block away from complete anarchy. Simple in concept, impossible in practice. The first night, as they prepped gear under red light, one of the operators, a broad-shouldered man named Keene, looked at her quietly and said, "You're the one from Coronado, right?" She didn't look up. "I'm the one packing your breaching charges. That's all you need to know." He chuckled, not unkindly. "Fair enough." That was it. No more questions. Professionals knew when silence meant respect. Hours later, they moved under the shroud of darkness. Boots whispering over broken glass. The smell of smoke thick in the air. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked, and a single shot echoed, then faded. Morgan took point, scanning corners, her mind detached from the fear most people feel in moments like this. She didn't see danger, she saw geometry, angles, cover, exposure. Her brain broke chaos into math. They reached the extraction point, a crumbling apartment building with a flickering stairwell light. The informant, code-named Falcon, was waiting inside, trembling, civilian, eyes hollow, hands shaking. The mission was routine, until it was. The call came in halfway through exfil. Enemy movement, 2 trucks inbound, fast. Echo teams scattered into cover. Morgan grabbed the civilian, pressed him flat against a wall. She could hear the engines approaching, headlights slicing through the night. Keene's voice crackled over comms. "We've got 20 seconds. Morgan, your call." She scanned their path, a narrow alley to the east, a small drainage tunnel half collapsed. Not enough time to debate. "Tunnel," she said, "move." They ran. The sound of engines grew louder behind them, shouts in a language that didn't matter. Bullets chipped concrete. Morgan shoved the informant ahead, guiding him through the tunnel's mouth. Then the collapse came. A tremor, a blast too close. The world went white, then black, then silent. When she came to, she was half buried in dust and stone, ears ringing, air thick with grit. She couldn't hear Keene's voice, couldn't hear anything. Her instincts took over: check vitals, assess damage, move. Her leg hurt bad but not broken. She pulled herself free, coughing, blinking through the haze. The tunnel was gone, crushed. The others were on the other side. She was sealed in, alone. For a moment she let herself breathe in, out. The dust tasted like metal. Then movement, a shadow shifting behind the smoke. Not her team, not friendly. She drew her sidearm. One breath, two, three. The figure stepped closer, rifle low, scanning. Morgan's grip tightened. She waited until he turned his head just enough. Then silence again, a soft click, one suppressed round. He dropped. She exhaled. And then the guilt hit, not for what she'd done, but for how easy it was. It wasn't supposed to feel like breathing, but for her, it always did. That's what they never understood back home. The quiet ones weren't fearless. They were just used to fear, trained to walk with it. Hours passed in that collapsed tunnel. She used her knife to dig out a path through the debris inch by inch. Sweat mixed with blood. Her radio was dead. Her flashlight flickered. And in that endless dark, she started to hear her own mind again. The thoughts she buried back in California. The face of the lieutenant. The sound of the slap. The mark on the mat. She didn't regret what she'd done, but she regretted what it had created. A legend. A story that carried her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She whispered to herself, voice hoarse, "I didn't come here to be remembered." Finally, after what felt like days, her hand broke through loose earth. Cold air rushed in. Stars above, real ones this time. She crawled out, gasping, body shaking from exhaustion. She had no sense of where she was, but somewhere out there she could hear distant gunfire. Echo was still fighting. She stood, wiped the blood from her face, and started walking. Hours later she found them. Two of them, Keene and Lasker, alive, pinned behind a burned-out vehicle, exchanging fire with unseen enemies. When they saw her, their expressions said everything. Disbelief, then relief, then something else, recognition. She dropped beside them, calm, steady. Status. "Two hostiles left," Keene panted. "Falcon's safe, we thought you were." "Don't finish that," she said. "Let's get this done." They moved like one organism. No hesitation, no words, just rhythm. 3 shots, 2 impacts, silence again. Afterward, Keene looked at her, shaking his head. "You really are something else." She met his gaze, cold and quiet. "No, I'm trained, there's a difference." He didn't argue, he didn't have to. They made it back to base at dawn, covered in dust and dried blood. The debrief was short, the kind that skips feelings and sticks to coordinates. Mission successful, extraction complete, casualties none. When the report was filed, her name wasn't even mentioned. Just, operator, Tier 1 female, performed exfil under adverse conditions. And that was exactly how she wanted it. That night, as she sat outside the tent cleaning her weapon, Keene joined her. The desert wind howled through the dunes. "You know," he said softly, "I heard your story before we deployed." She didn't look up. "Everybody has. They say you dropped a lieutenant in 2 seconds flat. They say a lot of things." He nodded. "That's the thing about stories, they grow legs, run faster than we do." She gave a faint smile. "Let them, I've got no use for them." He was quiet for a while, then said, "Still, I think it made a lot of people better." She paused. "Maybe, or maybe it just made them afraid." "Sometimes fear's the first step to respect," he said. She glanced at him. "You sound like Thorne." "Who's Thorne?" She shook her head, almost smiling. "Nobody." The wind blew harder, carrying sand across the camp. For a moment she closed her eyes, listening to it. It sounded almost like the ocean. Maybe that was why she stayed quiet so much, because silence always had something to say. Later that night, long after the others had turned in, she sat alone under the stars. No noise, no crowd, just the quiet heartbeat of the desert. She thought of the young sailor in the gym, the one who'd thanked her. She thought of the mark on the mat, the salute, the lesson. And she wondered, had she done the right thing? Maybe, maybe not. All she knew was that one act of defense had changed everything. For her, for them, for people she'd never even meet. That's the cost of silence. You never get to choose who hears it. She picked up a small rock and rolled it between her fingers. Her whisper was almost lost to the wind. Sometimes, strength isn't about surviving what's done to you. It's about not becoming it. The stars didn't answer. They never do. But in that lonely desert night, Specialist Morgan found something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not comfort, not pride. Just peace in knowing she'd acted when it mattered and stopped when it counted. And maybe that was enough. When she came home, the ocean smelled different. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was the silence she brought back with her. The air at Coronado was cooler than the desert, but somehow heavier. The gulls still cried overhead, the surf still crashed against the seawall, and the flags still rippled in the wind. But the base had changed. So had she. Specialist Morgan arrived without ceremony. No one knew she was coming, not officially. She walked across the tarmac in a simple uniform, duffel slung over one shoulder, her eyes hidden behind mirrored lenses. To anyone watching, she looked like another returning operator, tired, focused, unremarkable. But whispers spread fast, even faster than before. She's back. The Morgan counter. Dev Groose sent her out again, didn't they? The story had grown in her absence. It wasn't just a training tale anymore, it was legend. They said she'd been sent into a war zone alone. They said she'd walked through an ambush untouched. They said the same thing every myth says when it doesn't understand its subject: she's not human. She hated that, because she was painfully, achingly human. Her jaw still ached in cold weather. Her hands still trembled sometimes when she cleaned her weapon. She still woke in the middle of the night, heart racing, from dreams that weren't dreams at all. But the myth didn't allow for that. The myth had no space for weakness. When she checked in at headquarters, the clerk froze mid-sentence when he saw her name. He stammered something about the commanding officer wanting to see her. She nodded, wordless. Inside the office, Fleet Master Chief Thorne was waiting. He looked older, lines deeper, hair grayer, but his presence was still the same quiet authority wrapped in worn fatigue. He stood as she entered, specialist. Master Chief. He studied her for a moment, the kind of gaze that could peel away a uniform and see the scars beneath. You're thinner, he said finally. Less rations out there, she replied dryly. He smiled faintly. You always deflect with humor. Only when it's true. He motioned for her to sit. She didn't. They say you saved a dozen lives, he said, that you dug yourself out of a collapse and kept moving for 12 hours. They say a lot of things. His smile faded, and none of it from your mouth. I wasn't there for a story. He nodded slowly. That's what I respect about you. A pause stretched between them, comfortable but heavy. Finally, he spoke again. Do you know what's been happening here since you left? She shook her head. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small laminated card, the kind used in training modules. He slid it across the desk. On it were printed the words, Module 7B, Asymmetrical Grappling. And below that, in bold, Morgan Counter, developed from the Coronado incident. She stared at it, unmoving. It's in the official curriculum now, he said quietly. Every recruit learns it. Her jaw tightened. That's not mine. It is, he said. You earned it. I didn't want it. He leaned forward. You think we get to choose how the world remembers us? Her silence was answer enough. He sighed. You think being a legend is a reward? It is. It's a chain. I wore mine once too, and someday you'll pass it on to someone else. She looked up, eyes unreadable. I didn't ask for followers. Good, he said. Then you'll lead them right. For the first time in a long while, she looked away. Out the window, the ocean shimmered like liquid steel. I didn't want to humiliate him, she said quietly. I know. I just wanted him to stop. I know that too. But they made it into a story. Thorne nodded slowly. Because stories are how we remember pain without having to feel it again. You gave them a story to live by. That's bigger than any medal. She let that settle, the truth of it burned. After a while he stood, walked around the desk, and handed her something small, a faded patch. It wasn't an insignia. It was a scrap of blue mat with a tiny black star drawn on it. "They replaced the flooring last month," he said. "I kept this for you." She stared at it in her palm, at the little ink star that had marked a moment she'd spent years trying to forget. It felt like holding a ghost. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "Just remember, that star doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to everyone who learned from it." She closed her hand around the patch. "Then I hope they learned the right thing." Thorne looked at her proud, sad, reflective. They did. They learned to listen. That night Morgan walked the base alone, past the mess hall, past the barracks, past the gym where it had all happened. Through the windows she could see the new recruits training, sweating, grappling, shouting cadence. And for a second she saw herself among them again. The silence, the humiliation, the calm before the storm. She turned away. Outside, under the yellow glow of the security lights, the wind off the sea carried the faint echo of laughter, not cruel this time, just human. And she realized something she hadn't before. The legend wasn't just hers anymore. It had become a shield for others, a story that warned the arrogant and protected the underestimated. It had a life of its own. She found herself near the seawall where the waves crashed against concrete. She sat down, resting her hands on the edge, watching the water churn below. For a long while she said nothing, then softly, "They'll forget my name someday." From the shadows, a familiar voice answered, "Maybe, but not what you taught them." She didn't need to turn. She knew Thorne was there. He'd always been there, like a quiet guardian of those who carried burdens no one else could see. He stepped beside her, both of them looking out at the dark horizon. "You ever think about leaving for good?" he asked. "Every day." "Then why don't you?" She took a slow breath. "Because I haven't earned peace yet." He nodded. "None of us ever do." They stood together in silence, the night stretching long and deep around them. After a while he said, "You know what I tell new officers now?" She looked at him. "I tell them a story about respect, about a lieutenant who struck someone he thought was beneath him, and about the silence that taught him what authority really means." Morgan smiled faintly. "You still teaching through stories, huh?" He chuckled. "It's all I've got left." They stayed there until the first hint of dawn painted the water silver. When Thorne finally left, Morgan remained, watching, thinking. She took the small patch of mat from her pocket and set it on the concrete beside her. The wind almost carried it away, but she caught it, pressing it flat with her hand. "I don't belong to the story," she whispered. "But maybe the story belongs to something good." She looked up at the rising sun, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to smile, not out of pride but peace. Then she stood, squared her shoulders and walked away, not toward the base but toward the horizon. Because some people return home to rest, and others return home to prepare. Somewhere deep inside her, she knew this wasn't the end. There would always be another mission, another lesson, another moment where silence would need to speak again. But for now, that was enough. How long before a story stops being memory and becomes tradition? At Coronado, that line blurred long ago. Years passed. The base changed faces, commanders, even the paint on the walls. But the story, her story, never left. Every new class of recruits heard it their first week. Every instructor had a version. Some told it with awe, some with warning, but always with respect. The Davis mark, as they still called it, had been repainted when the mats were replaced, a small, precise black star in the same exact spot. It was part of the official layout now, Not in any manual, but no one dared remove it. The instructors would stand the recruits in a circle, the morning light slicing through the high windows, the smell of salt and rubber thick in the air. And they would begin. "This is where arrogance died," the chief would say. "This is where the quiet proved its strength." The young sailors, men and women both, would lean forward, curious. They'd heard rumors. The story had become folklore, something larger than any of them. "Her name was Morgan," the chief would continue. "Specialist, first class, Navy SEAL Development Group. She didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't threaten. She just acted." And then he'd pause, always at that same point, to let the silence hang. Because the silence was part of the story. They'd all heard about the slap, the takedown, the salute, but what lingered wasn't the action, it was the stillness that followed. That, more than anything, had shaped them. Across years, it became part of who they were. The lesson embedded itself into the culture. Respect before rank. Control before chaos. Silence before noise. And somewhere far away, continents away, Morgan lived her life unaware that her name had turned into a compass. After that morning by the seawall, she hadn't stayed. She'd gone back into the world's quiet corners, where uniforms had no names and missions had no witnesses. She didn't look back. But the world didn't forget her. One evening, years later, a young sailor named Alina Park found herself standing outside the same gym. She was 22, new to the base, a combat systems trainee. She'd grown up hearing the story back in high school. Her older brother had told it to her the night before shipping out. He said, "Remember this, strength isn't in shouting, it's in silence. That's what Morgan taught us." He never came home. So for Alina, the story wasn't just a lesson. It was a connection, a thread to a brother she'd never stop missing. That night the gym was empty, the lights dimmed. She walked to the center of the mat and knelt down, touching the star. Her fingers traced the edges just like hundreds had before her, but for her it wasn't folklore, it was faith. She whispered, "I wish I could have met you." The door opened behind her. Footsteps. She turned, startled. An older woman stood there, dressed in plain fatigues, hair tied back, eyes gray as storm clouds. She looked like anyone else on base, except something about her presence filled the room. Alina stood quickly. "Sorry, ma'am, I was just—" "It's all right," the woman said softly. Her voice was calm, controlled. "You're not the first to come here at night." Alina hesitated. "You know the story." A faint smile touched the woman's lips. "I might have heard it once or twice." Something about the tone made Alina pause. The realization came slowly, like dawn creeping over the horizon. Her throat tightened. "Wait, are you?" The woman nodded once. "I was." Alina's breath caught. "You're her." The woman looked at the mat. "That's what they say." Alina didn't know what to do. Salute, speak, stay silent. She did none of it, just stared, eyes wide. "I didn't think you were real," she said finally. "They talk about you like a ghost," Morgan finished for her. "That's not far off." Alina swallowed. "You changed everything here, the way people train, the way they think." Morgan shook her head. "I didn't change anything. They did. All I did was react to a moment." "But that moment wasn't meant to be remembered," Morgan said quietly. Alina frowned. "Then why do you come back?" Morgan looked down at the star. The ink was faded again. Time always does that. "I come back to make sure they're still teaching the right lesson." Alina tilted her head. "Which is?" Morgan's eyes lifted, sharp but kind. "That control is strength. That respect isn't given, it's earned. And that silence isn't weakness, it's discipline." Alina nodded slowly. "My brother used to say that. He said you taught him that." Morgan's expression softened. "What was his name?" "Daniel Park. He trained here years ago." Morgan's eyes flickered with recognition. "I remember him. quiet, good with his hands, built his own breaching tool out of scrap metal. Alina smiled, tears forming. Yeah, that was him. Morgan took a slow breath. He was a good sailor. He looked up to you, Alina whispered. He said you showed him that the loudest people weren't always the strongest. Morgan's gaze drifted to the wall where the fleet insignia hung. Then, I guess he understood more than most. They stood there for a long moment, two generations linked by silence and loss. Finally, Morgan said softly, "You know, they shouldn't have called it the Morgan counter." Alina blinked. Why not? Because it's not about me. It's about what comes after. The next person who stands up quietly and refuses to be less than they are. Alina smiled faintly. Then maybe we should call it the park counter next time. Morgan chuckled, a rare sound, deep and warm. Maybe we should. She looked at the star one last time, then at Alina. Take care of this place. It's not about legend. It's about standard. Make sure they never forget that. Alina nodded. I will. Morgan turned to leave. Wait, Alina called after her. Are you still in with the teams? Morgan paused at the door. The light caught the edge of her face, strong, lined, human. Once you've lived in silence, she said, you never really leave it. And then she was gone. Alina stood there alone again, the gym quiet except for the faint hum of the lights. She looked down at the star beneath her feet, the same mark that had started it all, and felt something shift inside her. The story wasn't just about a woman who struck back. It was about the strength to remain calm when every part of you wanted to shout. It was about the quiet professionalism that holds the world together when the loud fall apart. The next morning, Alina walked into training with a new steadiness in her stride. She didn't brag. She didn't explain. But when one of the recruits mocked another for falling behind, she stepped in not with anger but with calm, deliberate authority. Ease up, she said. You don't build strength by tearing someone down. The room fell silent. And in that silence, deep, respectful, familiar, something clicked. They didn't know she'd met the woman behind the myth. They didn't need to. They just saw someone who carried herself with the same quiet gravity. And the legacy continued. That night, under the same stars that had once watched over Morgan in the desert, Alina returned to the gym. She knelt beside the black star again and whispered, "You can rest now." But somewhere far away across an ocean, maybe in a war zone, maybe in peace, a woman named Morgan opened her eyes in the dark, sensing something she couldn't explain. She smiled faintly. Because legacies don't end. They just find new voices to carry them. And sometimes, the silence itself speaks loud enough to last forever. How do you end a life that's built on silence? You don't, you fade like waves pulling back from shore. Specialist Morgan's name had become a whisper again. Years had passed since that quiet meeting at Coronado, since the night she'd stood beside a young sailor named Alina Park and handed her the torch of something greater than legend. The world had moved on, new conflicts, new uniforms, new heroes. But some stories never stop breathing. They just go quiet until the next time they're needed. Morgan had spent the last 5 years in the shadows again. Advisory work mostly, off-grid assignments, small teams, no publicity. She liked it that way. She didn't need to lead anymore. She just needed to serve, quietly, correctly, with dignity. Her body bore the years of it, the small tremors in her right hand, the scars that ached when it rained. But her eyes, they were the same gray steel, clear, watchful, alive. The latest mission came without ceremony. No briefing room, no flag, just a folder slid across a table in a dim office somewhere overseas. Inside, photographs, maps, coordinates. The target wasn't a person, it was a pattern. A growing network of insurgents who'd been ambushing aid convoys under the guise of civilians. Her job was simple: advise the local unit on extraction protocols, identify their weakness, and get out. Simple never meant safe. She landed in-country under a different name, dressed in local fatigues, her insignia stripped clean. The air was hot and dry, thick with diesel fumes and dust. She walked through the base camp like a ghost, unnoticed, unbothered. The young commander she was assigned to brief, Captain Ruiz, greeted her with polite skepticism. He was young, sharp, full of confidence. The kind of confidence that used to belong to Lieutenant Davis. "You're the liaison," he asked, shaking her hand. "Didn't expect, well, someone like you." Morgan's expression didn't change. "Someone like me." He hesitated, just thought they'd send a senior officer. "They did," she said. "You just didn't recognize one." His eyebrows shot up, then he grinned, a little embarrassed. "Fair enough, ma'am." She didn't correct him. She never did. That evening she walked the perimeter of the camp, studying the terrain, the entry points, the blind angles. She made notes, quiet, methodical. Every detail mattered. Every shadow could hold a consequence. At dawn, the team moved out. 3 trucks, 10 men, 1 mission: recover stolen supplies before they crossed the border. Morgan rode in the rear vehicle, silent, scanning the horizon through dusty glass. The road twisted through dry valleys, the sun climbing fast. She could feel it, that edge, that tension before something goes wrong. Years of instinct whispering a single word: wait. The ambush came at 08:42. A flash. A blast. The world buckled. The lead truck went up in fire, black smoke rolling across the sky. Gunfire erupted from the ridges. Shouts, confusion. Morgan was already moving. She hit the ground, dragging one of the wounded clear, bullets snapping through the dust. Her hands were steady, her mind silent. She didn't hear fear, she heard geometry again. Angles, distance, cover. She grabbed a rifle from a fallen soldier, sighted down the ridge, and fired twice, deliberate, surgical. 2 flashes disappeared. Ruiz's voice cracked over comms. "We're pinned." Morgan looked to the right flank, a drainage ditch running parallel to the road. 12 o'clock, she said. "Flank left through the ditch. Use the smoke as cover. Move on my signal." "Who the hell?" "Move." Her tone cut through everything. Authority not of rank but of experience. The unit obeyed, without question. They shifted, crawling through the ditch as she covered, her shots precise, patient. The firefight lasted only minutes but felt eternal. Then silence, the thick kind, the aftermath. The men panted, shaken, counting heads. 3 down, 2 wounded. And in the center of it all, Morgan, calm as stone, lowering her rifle. Captain Ruiz approached, eyes wide. "Who trained you?" She looked at him, quiet, almost sad. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." He hesitated, then nodded. "We wouldn't have made it out without you." "You would have," she said. "You just needed to listen." That night she sat alone on a low wall outside the camp. The stars were harsh and brilliant, unbothered by the human noise below. She cleaned her weapon with the same precision as always, but her thoughts drifted. To Thorne, to Coronado, to Elena Park, to the black star on the mat that had somehow outlived them all. She wondered what they were teaching now. If anyone still remembered why she'd done what she did. If the legend had stayed honest, or if it had grown legs and run away from the truth. She didn't regret the story, but she regretted that it was still needed. That somewhere, even now, another young woman would have to prove her worth with silence, and another arrogant man would have to be taught the hard way. She whispered to herself, maybe someday they won't. In the distance, the horizon glowed with lightning, silent, beautiful, and dangerous. The next morning, orders came for her extraction. The mission was a success. Her part, as always, was unrecorded. She packed her gear slowly, feeling every movement in her aging joints. As she slung her bag over her shoulder, Captain Ruiz appeared. "I looked you up," he said a little shyly. After last night. Oh, there's not much in the system, just a reference code and a training module. He paused. Something called the Morgan counter. She smiled faintly, still teaching that, huh? He nodded. We all learned it in basic. And what did you learn from it? He thought for a moment. That respect matters more than rank, that sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. Her smile widened just enough to show warmth. Then they taught it right. He saluted her, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. She returned it, slow, deliberate. And then she was gone again. No farewell, no ceremony, just the echo of boots on gravel and the faint whistle of wind. On the flight home, she watched the desert fade into clouds. Her reflection in the window looked older now, lines around her eyes, hair streaked with gray. But the calm remained. That unshakable stillness. She closed her eyes and thought of the mat. The sound of the slap. The silence that followed. So much had changed since then, and yet nothing really had. Men still mistook volume for strength. Women still had to prove the obvious. The quiet still had to fight to be heard. But somewhere out there, recruits were learning. Officers were listening. Culture was shifting slowly, painfully, but truly. And that, she realized, was enough. She whispered, "That's the mission now." The plane banked, sunlight spilling across her face. And for the first time, she let herself rest. She didn't know it yet, but this would be her last deployment. When she landed, she'd signed the retirement papers she'd been avoiding for years. No headlines, no speeches, just a quiet signature at the bottom of a form. And when they asked her for a final statement, she'd write, "Respect is the highest form of discipline. Silence is its language." Then she'd leave the pen on the desk, walk out the door, and disappear into the crowd of sailors, one more ghost among many. What happens when the mission ends? When the weapons are cleaned, the uniforms folded, the call signs erased. For most, there's a party, a medal, a handshake. For Morgan, there was silence. She walked out of the base gates one last time, duffel slung over her shoulder, the ocean wind brushing across her face. No one saluted. No one played a march. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Because this piece wasn't about applause, it was about breathing. She moved to a small coastal town 2 states away. A quiet place with foggy mornings and gulls that cried like old ghosts. Her neighbors didn't know who she was. To them, she was just Miss Morgan, the quiet woman who fixed her own roof and helped shovel sand after storms. Sometimes the local kids would see her running at dawn, steady, disciplined, always in that old gray hoodie. They thought she used to be a coach or something. They weren't wrong. She lived simply. No medals on the wall, no photos in uniform. The only thing she kept from her years in service was that tiny piece of mat, the one with the faded black star. It sat in a small wooden frame by her window, next to a single folded flag. Every morning, she'd look at it for a moment before going for her run, not to remember the pain, but the principle. Because that mark, that story, had outgrown her. And maybe that was the point. Once late in autumn, a letter arrived. No return address, just a Navy crest stamped on the corner. Inside was a photo, a training class at Coronado. And there in the background, painted on the blue mat, was the star. But this time there was something new beneath it, a line stenciled in white. "Strength speaks softly." She smiled, a small private smile. The letter was signed, Lt. Elena Park. There was no message beyond that. None was needed. Morgan set the photo by the window, next to the framed mat, and sat down with her coffee. For a while she said nothing, just listened to the sound of waves against the rocks, the same rhythm that had followed her across continents, wars, and lifetimes. Sometimes people in town would stop by. A fisherman who'd heard she was good at fixing nets. a widow who needed her porch steps replaced. Morgan always helped, quietly, no questions. They'd thank her, try to pay her. She'd just shake her head. "You can buy me a coffee sometime." No one ever noticed the old seal insignia tucked in the corner of her tool drawer, or the small scar just below her jawline, the place where arrogance had once struck her. And maybe that was better, because she wasn't a hero. She was a reminder. A few years later, a local reporter came through town doing a small piece on veterans living along the coast. When they found out about her service, what little they could, they asked if she'd sit for an interview. She said no at first, but then she thought of Alina, of Thorne, of all the young recruits who'd learned from the silence. So she agreed on one condition. "No ranks," she said, "no titles, just truth." The interview was short. The reporter expected stories of combat, medals, missions. Instead, she gave them pauses. Long ones. The kind that made you think more than any answer could. "What was the hardest part?" the reporter asked. "Remembering who I was when no one was watching," she said. "What do you miss the most?" "The sound of discipline, the kind you can feel in your bones." "What do you want to be remembered for?" She looked out the window at the waves. "Not for what I did," she said quietly, "for what I didn't have to say." The reporter didn't understand at first, but when the story was published, the town did. People started greeting her differently after that, not with pity, but with quiet respect. One morning, she found a small gift on her porch. A wooden carving, rough but heartfelt, of an eagle perched on a coiled rope. Under it, someone had written, "Thank you for teaching us silence." She never found out who left it. Maybe she didn't want to. Years rolled by, slow and kind. Her hair turned silver, her runs got shorter. But the calm never left her. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and the tide crept high, she took a walk down to the beach. The sand was cool, the sea breeze sharp. And in the fading light, she stopped just for a moment and looked back at the horizon. She thought about all the faces that had passed through her life. The arrogant lieutenant who'd struck first and learned last. The master chief who'd believed in her when no one else did. The young sailor who carried her lesson forward. And she realized something simple. Every act of quiet strength ripples outward, unseen, unstoppable. It doesn't need noise. It doesn't crave credit. It just moves through people, changing them a little at a time. She closed her eyes and let the wind wash over her face. For the first time in years, she felt completely still. Somewhere far behind her, at Coronado, the new recruits would be training. They'd still walk the mats, still touch that black star. Some wouldn't even know who Morgan was. And that was perfect. Because heroes aren't meant to be remembered by name. They're meant to be remembered by change. As the sun disappeared, Morgan whispered one last thought, a prayer, a promise, a truth carved deep in her heart. Dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The tide rose higher, covering her footprints one by one. And as the waves erased her path, the world stayed quiet but not empty. Because silence like hers doesn't vanish. It lingers. It teaches. It endures. And somewhere, in the echo of training halls and the calm before every mission, a quiet voice would always remain. Steady, strong, unseen, reminding them all that true power doesn't roar. It breathes.